All right, great. Everything's
So welcome to the Introduction to Computational Neuroscience workshop. My name is Bhavjeet Sanghera, and I'm going to start off by giving you like a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about, and I'll introduce my co-presenter Priya, who's going to be presenting some of the slides alongside me. So this workshop is going to consist of three main parts. So we're going to start off by talking about neuroscience at a very basic level. We're going to talk about the brain, the nervous system, and we're going to explain the concepts of neural circuits and how neurons are the functional units of the brain and how they all come together to create computational thinking and human intelligence. And then we're going to move more onto the computational side. We're going to talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and how all of these complex algorithms are kind of trying to mimic the brain, and are trying to replicate the processes in computers to execute higher functions. And then we're going to close by talking about, and I have a hands-on activity for you guys there. And then we're going to close by talking about neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And we're going to talk about the challenges associated with those diseases and how in fact artificial intelligence is being used in these fields to allow for earlier prevention. Priya, do you want to?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Priya. So I was just going to start off with a quick introduction on neuroscience. So neuroscience is a field that focuses specifically on the structure function of the nervous system in the brain. And so as humans, many of our bodily functions, such as moving, thinking, breathing, they're all connected to the brain. And our brain is connected to the different parts of our body through the nervous system, and there's two of them. There's the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. And so through those different nervous systems, our brain is able to send different messages to our body to carry out different functions. Next slide, please. So this is a very basic breakdown of the brain. Our brain is split into two hemispheres, the left and the right, and each hemisphere sort of watches out for the other and is responsible for the other. However, each half of the brain has different functions. The left side is used for more logical things, whereas the right side is more creative. So if you're more of a STEM sort of student, you're probably going to use more of your left side, versus if you're more in the liberal arts, maybe your right side we would use more. And so our next slide shows a more detailed breakdown of the brain. So one really cool thing about the brain is that it studies itself. So different parts of the brain have different functions. For example, the cerebrum is used for interpreting touch, vision, hearing, as well as speech, reasoning, emotions, and learning, and also helps control the movement of our body and connects the two hemispheres. The frontal lobe is used for more personality, behavior, emotions, judgment, making decisions, speech, so such as speaking and writing, and that's through the Broca's area. Body movement, which is in the motor strip of your frontal lobe, and intelligence, concentration, and self-awareness. The parietal lobe is more for interpreting language and words, and it also has a sensory strip, so you can sense touch, pain, and temperature. And our parietal lobe also interprets signals from many of our senses, such as vision, hearing, and like touching different things, and also like signals from our memories. It also allows us to have spatial and visual perception. The occipital lobe of our brain is mostly for vision. So it lets us see or like interpret when we see color, light, and movement. Then we have the temporal lobe, which is used mostly for like understanding language. That's to the Wernicke's area, memory, hearing, sequencing, and organization. And then we also have the amygdala, which allows us to perceive emotions and control our anger. And also it allows us to store memories of past events. So we as people can refer to those emotions later on. The hippocampus is used for learning and memory, whereas the hypothalamus is used for releasing hormones and regulating body temperature. The corpus callosum is very important because it connects both hemispheres of the brain and helps us sort of coordinate our thoughts. The cerebellum is more for balance and coordination, and the brainstem connects the cerebrum to the rest of the brain. Next slide, please. So these are some facts about the brain. So our brain has cells called neurons, and those neurons are kind of like little roads where we're able to send electrical signals, and those electrical signals basically pass on the messages of our brain. So for example, when you do something, and we gave the example of riding a bike, the pathways in our brain send message. So the more pathways that we send about one idea, the stronger those pathways become. And if you don't do something very often, the pathways become weak. So for example, if you were like doing a math problem and you hadn't done it for many years, chances are that you probably will struggle a little bit getting used to it at first, but rather in comparison, if you're someone who's learning that math concept for the first time and doing a lot of practice, chances are that you'll be better at it. And your brain, since all of our functions are tied to the brain, voluntary and involuntary functions, there are a lot of messages sent. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the basic structure of a neuron. Our brain consists of many neurons that send signals between one another to pass on messages to different parts of the body. The cell body, which is the big purple structure on the left and has the nucleus, basically carries the genetic information of the cell. Oh, sorry, I'll slow down a little bit. And then the dendrites, which are the like the little extensions on the cell body, they receive electrical signals from other cells and pass them down the axon. So because our brain is a pathway of so many different neurons, they're passing electrical signals from neuron to neuron, and the dendrite is what receives that electrical signal from an old neuron. And then the axon, so that electrical signal is passed on through the axon to the axon terminal. And the axons are covered with the myelin sheath, which basically allows greater electrical conduction and allows the electrical signals with the messages to be passed on more efficiently. And the axon terminal is at the end of the neuron, and it passes neurotransmitters, which are signaling molecules between the neurons. And that's basically how the neurons communicate with each other, and that's through neurotransmitters. And the area where those neurotransmitters are exchanged is called the synapse. Next slide, please. So this slide shows on a more mathematical scale and a more scientific scale as to how the electrical signals are passed on. Our brain has a concentration gradient and an electrical gradient. This slide is more for more focused on the electrical gradient part of the cell. So our brain has sodium and potassium ions, and they're set at a very specific concentration. And any change in that concentration will cause will change the charge of the overall neuron, which allows the electrical signal to be passed on. So this curve is called the action potential curve, and there's a certain portion of it called a threshold, and it's an electrical threshold. So when we change the concentrations of the sodium and potassium ions, that causes depolarization of charges, and that causes our brain's electrical concentrations to hit that threshold, which causes depolarization, which you can see causes a really high increase in voltage. And so that basically allows our brain to send that electrical signal down. And then after that electrical signal is sent, our body likes to have a balance, which is called homeostasis. So it goes into a region of repolarization. However, our bodies, sometimes we overshoot, and that overshooting is the refractory period. And our body has to get back from that overshooting back to its original balance area, which is the resting state. And once it reaches the resting state, it's ready for another action potential.
Okay, so now I'm going to be talking a bit more about human intelligence and how I'm going to move more into the computational side. So like at first glance, when you're looking at this picture, the first thoughts that come to your mind are that this dog is cute, that this dog might be sad, it's definitely fluffy. But how is it that when we're looking at this dog, we're able to come up with all these adjectives within milliseconds? And how is it that we're able to, like, and on the other side, how is it that we're able to like cross out so many other options? How are we able to say, like, within a matter of milliseconds that this dog is not, that he's not happy, that he's not excited? How are we able to kind of condense all of these possibilities down into what we're actually seeing? So our ability to kind of reach this conclusion is what is known as human intelligence. And from a higher level perspective, when you're thinking about human intelligence and you're thinking about what does it mean to integrate these different thoughts, like from a higher level perspective, you can kind of boil it down to three key elements. Like, we have our own perception that when we're looking at the dog, our brain is processing that the dog is cute. We have our own cultural idea of what is it that makes something cute, and we're kind of bringing that in as well. And then we also have our own instinct about just kind of like that gut feeling about how does the dog look. And when you're looking at it from a very higher perspective, you're not really considering what's going on in the brain. These three elements are really how are you deciding that this dog is cute, and is how we're able to able to process that. But how is it that we were able to process all these thoughts so quickly? And this is where the concept of human intelligence comes in, and it's the process by which, and human intelligence, like very simply put, is the process by which humans have an experience. We learn from that experience, and we save that experience. So the next time that something similar comes up, we can draw from our past knowledge. So I'll give you a very basic example. Let's say that when you were very, very young, like you saw a hot metal object, and without thinking, you just put your hand on that object. But immediately you would have retracted your hand away because of that pain and the fact that your body responds to that pain, and you have kind of that knee-jerk reflex to putting your hand on a hot object that you immediately retract it because of that pain. And the first time that you do this, you're going to pull your hand away immediately. But what happens afterwards? After the first time that you do this, after the first time that you go through this sequence of events where you put your hand on the hot metal object and your hand burnt, and then you pulled your hand back, that entire event and that entire sequence gets stored in your brain. And that sequence of events becomes what is known as an experience. And it's something that you're going to draw upon later. And it's how that experience is going to modulate how you respond to different situations. So the next time that you see a hot metal object, you're not going to touch it. And because instead you're going to draw upon that past experience. You're going to remember that the last time I touched that, ow, it hurt. So now I'm not going to touch it again. And you're going to be kind of taking these past experiences to make new experiences. And this entire process of learning, comparing a previous experience to a new possibility, and then making a decision and then actually acting upon it, is the key to human intelligence. And you might think that this is a very basic example, but as we accumulate more and more experiences, our responses become more and more complex. And this very key concept of human intelligence, this very basic process, is the basis of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So what is artificial intelligence? Well, artificial intelligence is, at its core, is biomimicry. And what is biomimicry? Biomimicry is humans' attempt to replicate what we're seeing in nature in machines. So biomimicry is this concept that, novelly we can only go so far on our own on just developing new technologies. Every now and then it is important the concept of biomimicry is that if we can replicate what we're seeing in nature, we can get similar results. So that was the very basis of artificial intelligence, is that we can take what we're seeing in nature, what we're seeing in our human brains, this process of intelligence, and we can put it inside of a computer, and the computer can do the exact same thing. But originally, like in the late 1900s, when this process was being developed, the goal was very different than what we're seeing today and what we understand today as artificial intelligence. What we're seeing before, what the intention was to replicate the entire brain. But what we realized is that that was just not feasible because we don't understand enough about the brain ourselves to do that. So what we ended up doing is so later, like in the 1990s, 1980s, when a lot of research was being done in this field on a more theoretical level, what was being considered is how can we replicate that process of human intelligence that I was just talking about? The very basic process of adjusting current weights based on past experiences, and that's the idea of artificial intelligence, and that's the idea of neural networks in particular. So artificial intelligence is a little bit more of a broader field. It's where we're creating computer systems that can perform the tasks that human intelligence typically do. But neural networks are kind of like a subunit of that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about neural networks and how exactly we're mimicking that process. So what are neural networks? So as I was talking about earlier, it's biomimicry. It's a copy of the brain's functioning inside of a computer. And we're typically doing this using a software program. And the idea of neural networks is training. That's the key to neural networks. Is the same training is if you're looking for an example similar to what I was talking about earlier, training is the experience. We're feeding the computer tons of experiences so that it too can create more informed decisions and more precise decisions than in the past when we were just hard coding the computer to execute certain functions and it wasn't really modifying itself based on what it was seeing new. So the idea is that once we've trained a computer, once we've fed it enough experiences, once we've fed enough experiences into the neural network, it should be able to classify and identify patterns in a large amount of information. And over time, as we give it more and more experiences, it can do this at very high speeds and sometimes even faster than humans and even more accurately than humans. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later when I talk about some of the applications of this. So neural networks are comprised of layers of neurons. And each of these layers, it's very similar to what Priya was talking about earlier with the neural circuits in the brain and how they're very set pathways to accomplish very set paths, very set actions. The concept behind neural networks is that we have these layers of neurons and each neuron has its own weight. And what a weight is that it is like a preset value that we're then gonna modify with by feeding it more and more training data or experiences. And what are the advantages of neural networks? Well, the biggest advantage of the neural network, as I was talking about earlier, as compared to other like normal computer programs, is that neural networks are able to learn and they're able to modify themselves based on past experiences. And another great thing about them is that they're very generalizable. So let's say if I train a neural network to accomplish one job, it could be possible that I can by feeding it just a little bit more data, I can train that same neural network to do an entire other job. And this generalizability is very important in neural networks. And I'm going to talk. So these are just a few applications of neural networks. They're typically used in identifying patterns, whether it be in identifying patterns in like an animal's movement in the wild, or identifying patterns in someone's handwriting. Or in the way that someone writes and trying to replicate their style of writing. There's also applications in image processing where we're seeing a lot of this in the medical field where like if you feed a neural network pictures of tissue, like of like EEG scans or MRI scans, it can be trained to classify, it can be trained to detect like certain markers of like cancer or like multiple sclerosis. We're gonna talk about that a bit more later. And also character recognition, like if I were to like write my, if I were to like write a paper on by hand, and we could train a neural network to identify my handwriting over someone else's, and train it to identify like the way I write certain letters. And it's also used in forecasting. So it kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier with how we're using these past experiences to create present judgments. We're doing the same thing with neural networks. If we train a neural network with so much past information that it has, that it is very highly trained and is very accurate, we can actually make predictions about the future and the way things could be moving, you know, as time progresses. And we're seeing a lot of this in the financial markets, where people are attempting to create neural networks that can predict the stock market, for example. So the key to artificial neural networks is the fact that they are artificial, and they're attempting to replicate human intelligence, but they're not really doing it the exact same way that we are. It's kind of simplifying it down. And so there are three main components to a neural network. You have the input layer, the hidden layer, and the output layer. So the input layer is where we're feeding in our own data. And I think the first talk today was talking a little bit about this, about how you know, there's two kinds of learning. There's supervised and unsupervised. You know, and this is kind of where that's happening, is where as it kind of hinges on the type of data that we're feeding it in. So the input layers where we're feeding in our own data. The hidden layers are where we have these collections of neurons and these layers of neurons. And these neurons are linked by synapses. And you know, you might remember synapses from what Priya was talking about earlier, with how neurons are connected by synapses. And basically what's happening at these synapses, the synapses are the links between different neurons. And what's happening there is that they have, that's what I'm talking about with the weights. And that's where each synapse has its own weight assigned to it. And based on the inputs that you're putting in, the neuron's gonna modify its weight by it's gonna modify what you're feeding in by multiplying it by a weight. And that's how it's able to learn. So the hidden layers are really where, a lot of the complexity of the neural network comes in. And it's why a lot of people, sometimes when they're talking about artificial intelligence and neural networks in particular, they can talk about it as kind of a black box, where, you know, you're feeding a bunch of information in, but you don't really understand what's going on precisely. You know, you're within this model, and how exactly is it precisely adjusting. But these hidden layers is where you have these layers of neurons that are needed to create, to make sense of the more complex data. And this is where deep learning is occurring. And then you have your output layer, which is where, based on all of this data, the neural network is able to give you a final value that, based on whatever action you're trying to complete. So for example, let's say if I wanted to, let's say, you know, take this neural network here, this image from, which we got from a YouTube video, where we're trying to figure out what my test on what my score on a test would be based on the amount of time I'm sleeping and the amount of time I'm studying. So I'm going to feed in to the neural network how long I'm sleeping, how long I'm studying, and what my score was. So that's your training data. So let's say I slept for 5 hours, I studied for 1 hour, and I ended up getting a B or a C on the test. All right, so let's say I got a C on the test. So I'm going to feed in that data into the neural network, and I'm going to feed in lots and lots of these similarly structured data, where I'm going to define, you know, how long I slept, how long I studied, and what I got on the test. You know, let's say I studied for 5 hours, I slept for 8 hours, I got an A on the test. You know, I feed all of that in, and then after the neural network has been trained, so after we fed the neural network enough data and it's trained itself on that data enough times that we think it's sufficient, we can stop that training, and then we can begin testing the neural network, which is where I now put in a new set of data and we see how well the neural network was able to predict. So let's say I have a test coming up, and you know, I plan on studying for 4 hours and sleeping for 10 hours. And I feed that data into the neural network, and it feeds out that if I do that, I get an A. So now that's the testing layer. So that's kind of how neural networks are working. And when I was talking about earlier about generalizability, a key of the neural network is that you know, let's say I studied for, you know, like, let's go back to that same example. I studied for 4 hours, slept for 10, and I ended up actually getting a B on that test. So, so what the neural network is now going to do is going to compare what I actually got on the test to what it predicted I would get on the test, and it's going to modify itself accordingly. So it's always learning. So the key to neural networks is propagation, and this is how it is able to modify those weights. And so what's really happening is this repetition of forward and backward propagation. So forward propagation is where we're setting a set of weights to each synapse, and we're calculating an output based on that. But you might be wondering, when we're first building the neural network, how do we define those weights if we don't have any past data to work on? So the way we do that is we usually just send like a random value. Like let's say if the range is 0 to 1, we might just set a random value of 0.5, and that'll be our base. And as we train it, that 0.5 is gonna go up or down. It's gonna adjust accordingly so that we can achieve the highest accuracy. And what's happening in back propagation is where we're comparing what the neural network was able to predict, and we're comparing the margin of error with what we said it should have been. Like we're comparing that the neural network said I was going to get a B on the test when I actually got an A on the test, or other way around. But it's going to compare the margin of error there, and it's going to adjust the weights accordingly so that it can minimize the amount of error. That's the goal. That's why we keep on training it, so that we can minimize that error and we can achieve the highest level of accuracy. And we continue to repeat this forward and backward propagation until our weights are calibrated to accurately predict the output, until we're satisfied with it. So what are the applications of artificial intelligence? Well, we're seeing artificial intelligence everywhere. This is some of you may have heard of the phrase like the AI revolution. And this is what it's talking about, is how artificial intelligence is aiming to bridge the gap between humans and machines. And because of this, is being integrated into so many applications. The one you're probably most familiar with are like personal assistants like Siri, Google Home, Alexa. And basically what's happening there is that those programs are using machine learning and artificial intelligence to create more personalized suggestions, based on like your past preferences. And we're also seeing this in like YouTube and Google, Amazon and Netflix. They're all using artificial intelligence to give you more personalized suggestions. Like Netflix is using the past movies and TV shows that you're watching to suggest new ones. And the same thing with YouTube. They're looking at the videos that you like and they're suggesting you new ones. And based on the ones that you're actually clicking on, it's going to adjust itself accordingly. And then Amazon, of course, they're using artificial intelligence to suggest to kind of understand what your buying preferences are, and tailoring the application accordingly. And then probably one of the most impressive examples of artificial intelligence in our electronics is the application Pandora. I'm not sure if a lot of you guys use Pandora. It's a music radio app, and it's very impressive in that the way that they've built the applications is that the people over at Pandora, they've analyzed each song in their database for over 400 possible music characteristics. And they're using those 400 characteristics to give you very personalized suggestions. And that's why Pandora has incredibly accurate suggestions and can give people very, very personalized results, and bring them songs that they otherwise wouldn't have thought of, but they really like. Automated driving, we're using deep learning to automatically detect objects and pedestrians on the road. Tesla's car is like the semi-automated driving, and that's how it's operating. They're training the neural network like in a lab environment to be able like on video footage of the road, and is continuously training it so that we can achieve a super high accuracy, so that we can minimize like the number of accidents associated with automated driving. And then in aerospace and defense, this goes back to kind of that image recognition I was talking about, how we're able to identify objects from satellites and locate areas of interest, and identify safe or unsafe zones for troops. And this is really being used in a lot of areas. And in fact, I'm my own research. I've been doing research for about over a year now, and it's in a very similar area. Not necessarily this, but what I've been doing is I've been studying zebrafish, and I've been using image recognition of the videos of zebrafish so that I can create a better tracking for the zebrafish, and that I can track it better, And then I'm using artificial intelligence to actually predict the behavior of the zebrafish so that we can have a better understanding of how the brain executes motor functions. And that's my research. We're seeing it in medical research. I was talking about earlier, like histology and radiology. Like histology is a study of tissues. Radiology is a study of is like diagnostic radiology is the use of like MRIs and these different scans to detect abnormalities. And we're seeing artificial intelligence being used to bridge the gap between the doctor and their diagnosis. And although artificial intelligence hasn't totally replaced this application where where the computer is detecting if there's something wrong in like your medical scans. But what it is doing is, but as of right now, what we are seeing is that, that doctors and radiologists and histologists, they're using artificial intelligence as kind of a companion tool. Like they're using it to help them, they're using it in their own studies so that they can, so that when they are, diagnosing patients, they have that AI so that it can kind of increase the accuracy. And we're using AI to kind of bridge the gap and increasing the accuracy of these doctors' diagnosis of patients' conditions. And that even that small increase of accuracy in diagnosis has the potential to impact lots and lots of lives. So it's truly a very important application. So I have this link here that I want you all to go to. So this is a website where I think it'll give you a better understanding of how neural networks are working. So you can all go to this link. Let me see if I can. Let me open it myself. Let's see. Okay. So you should be able to see the page. So like take a second to get here. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be basically simulating a neural network, and we're going to try and see how is it used in detecting patterns. So yeah, okay. Now that you've reached this page, so this is a website developed by TensorFlow.org, and TensorFlow is one of the leading companies in artificial intelligence. What they do is they create AI libraries and all these other very important tools that people are using in developing artificial intelligence applications. And in fact, like a bunch of common applications of their program include like Airbnb is using it, Coca-Cola is using TensorFlow, Intel's using it, PayPal, Visco, Twitter. They're all utilizing the programs made by TensorFlow to in their own applications. But what you can do here at this website is it'll give you a better understanding of how our input and our hidden layers are being integrated into coming up with an output. So what we have here, we have these patterns, and there's about 4 of them that you can play around with. And what we're doing is what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and identify the clusters. So this is the default where we have 2 features that we're detecting, and we have 2 hidden layers, each with their own neurons, and each of these neurons are connected. And we can see here that these synapses have the weights listed, and we see the default here is like 4.49, negative 0.37. It depends on it depends on what the defaults are. And let's say if we just run it based on these, it's going to take it a couple of seconds, but you saw that within 79 iterations, 79 attempts to classify it, we were able to classify the cluster. And if you look here at the output, we'll see that our accuracy really, like this is our margin of error, and you can really see that how it got drastically lower as the iterations went on. And here is the learning rate. This is how we're modifying the weights at the synapse. And if you look here again, you can see that the weights have changed. And that's what's happening here. Is that over time these weights are modifying and adjusting so that we can achieve a better cluster. Because if you just ran like these same features on this image, it would just stay in place. It wouldn't really adjust itself. So that's why we need, that's really where the benefit of machine learning comes in, is the ability to automatically adjust itself and the possibilities that come along with that. So, feel free to spend, 5 or 10 minutes, just playing around on this website. You can add more and more hidden layers. You can add the number of neurons you're looking at, and then you can test out a different pattern. So I'll add these 2 features to look at, and I'll run it, and look at that. It classified it, within very few iterations. And I think that this is the most complicated one. So feel free to try and see how fast you can identify the clusters. It takes some time. But I think the really good thing about this website is that, for a lot of people, when they're learning about artificial intelligence, they're learning about machine learning. I was talking about earlier, a lot of people can kind of describe it as being a bit of a black box, where you're feeding in this input data, but you don't really understand what's going on the inside. But I think this is a really good job of showing you how the hidden layers are being modulated, how they're being modified, so that you can really understand what's going on in the classification, and not just be feeding a bunch of information and letting a program run and then getting an output. So feel free to play around here for 3 or 4 more minutes.
Bhavjeet, while everyone's playing around, we did have a question earlier on in the conversation. What triggers an action potential or depolarization, such as would the potassium and sodium ion concentrations change?
Sure, yeah, I can give an answer, and then Priya, if she wants, she can add on. Yeah, so basically what's happening is that neurons are the building blocks of the nervous system, but they don't just exist by themselves. They're kind of connected in these longer neural circuits. So what you have is like a chain of neurons, and what's happening is this kind of relationship between the chemical and the electrical, where neurotransmitters are being released at the synapse site, which is exciting the neuron to release an action potential. So a previous neuron is exciting the next neuron to pass the threshold and release an action potential. Priya, if you want to add, if you have anything to add.
Yeah. So I wasn't sure how deep to go into this, just because volumes have been written on action potentials, but on a more basic level, our neurons have a certain concentration of sodium and potassium ions that sort of keeps it as a balance. And our cell membranes have sodium potassium pumps and sodium potassium channels that basically allow sodium and potassium ions to go in and out of the neuron. So as Bhavjeet said earlier, when you have an action potential coming, or an electrical signal coming from a past neuron, it allows these channels to open, and the channels are always open, but the pumps to open, which allows a change in concentration of sodium and potassium ions. And because those ions are charged, it creates a charge difference, which causes the hyperpolarization of the neuron. Hopefully that's not too complicated and makes sense, or it answers the question.
Great, thank you. There are currently no other questions.
Okay, great. So I think we'll allow the audience to play around with this for a couple more minutes, and then I think we'll go back to the slides, and then feel free to play around with this after the presentation, or yeah. So it's a great tool to kind of familiarize yourself with the process of machine learning, and how the neurons are modified. Okay, so I think we'll come back to the presentation now. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes.
All right. So now we're going to talk about neurodegenerative diseases, and I think, Priya, if you want to start.
Yeah. So our brain, our neurons, once they die, they don't grow, they don't regenerate. So a lot of our other cells, such as our blood cells, our skin cells, they regenerate after they die and they replace each other, but the neurons don't. And so some of the diseases that have to do with our neurons not being able to regenerate are neurodegenerative diseases, and the ones that we're going to be touching on are Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and Huntington's. Next slide, please. So as I said earlier, that our neurons don't regenerate or reproduce, and if they die or get damaged, they can't be replaced by our body. And when that happens, we have problems with our movement, which is called ataxia, and we have problems with our mental functions, which are called dementias. And these diseases currently are incurable, but there are certain treatments that can help delay their impact. Next slide, please. So one of them is Parkinson's disease, and Parkinson's, as I said earlier, is an incurable, but it's still treatable neurodegenerative disease. And one of the neurotransmitters in our brain is dopamine. And when our body has degeneration of the dopamine neurons, it causes one of the first stages you can see are tremors in one's hands or limbs. But as time goes on and as more and more neurons die, a person will have slow movement, stiffness, and lack of balance. And the way that the dopamine causes this is that because dopamine is a neurotransmitter and is used to pass on the signals from neuron to neuron, when that neurotransmitter becomes non-functional, there's a lack of the signals being passed on, which causes Parkinson's. And you can often see a person's Parkinson's, they're very shaky, and it's not something that they can control. It just naturally happens. Next slide, please. Alzheimer's, I think many of us have heard of Alzheimer's before, but essentially it's memory loss. And people with Alzheimer's, their memories essentially gets destroyed, and they start lacking thinking skills, and they lack the ability to perform daily tasks. And this is because of amyloid beta plaques that form tangles in the brain. And our brain has a protein called the amyloid precursor protein. And when that protein starts breaking down, parts of that protein and those parts that break down of it, they form these plaques that basically come in between different neurons, which inhibits the ability for signals to be transferred from neuron to neuron. Next slide, please. Huntington's disease, it's an inherited disease which destroys the neurons. And so someone with Huntington's, they have slow loss of coordination, mental function, and then they have changes in their personality. And as you have seen, like a lot, like especially with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and even Huntington's, a lot of these diseases have to do with signals being passed on from neuron to neuron. And that plays into the fact that our brain is a giant road and connection of these different neurons, and it runs on these signals being transferred from one another. And when that doesn't happen, then we face problems.
So now we're going to talk about how we have these neurodegenerative diseases, and the reason why they're so problematic is because of the fact that neurons don't regenerate, they don't reproduce. So and now I'm going to talk a little bit more about how artificial intelligence is being utilized in kind of solving this, and not really solving this problem, but allowing for earlier detection. So one of the biggest complications associated, or one of the biggest issues associated with these neurodegenerative diseases is the fact that they're oftentimes detected a little bit too late, and the consequence of that is that patients don't have is that if patients knew about the disease ahead of time, they could have had the opportunity to make lifestyle changes and begin going to therapy and taking part in these other activities that could slow the progression of the disease, so that they could have a higher quality of life and live for a little bit longer. And in fact, artificial intelligence is being utilized to kind of solve this problem in early detection. So I was talking a little bit earlier about how artificial intelligence is being used in the field of in the medical field. One of the biggest advances actually occurred very recently in 2019, where a professor from the University of California published a finding that he was able to develop an artificial neural network that was able to predict based on like past memory loss of a patient whether or not they were high risk of developing Alzheimer's. And the fact that the biggest thing was that they were able to predict this 6 years earlier than traditional brain scans would have been able to. And the fact that they were able to predict this 6 years before means that patient who is at risk of developing this this debilitating disease will have prior knowledge that they could utilize to change their lifestyle, to begin going to therapy, and to begin taking part in all these other activities that could be used in slowing down the progression of Alzheimer's and the accompanying dementia. And this is a huge step forward in helping patients get earlier intervention. So what we gave you all today was a very brief introduction to the field of neuroscience. But the big question is, how much do we actually know about brain function? Well, the truth is very little, and it's surprising how little we know. We have yet to understand how information is encoded by neurons into our memory. We have yet to understand how brain states translate into actions. How is it that how exactly are the exact pathways that lead from having a thought of doing an action to actually executing the action, and all of the other influences that go into that process. Neurophysiology is one of the big fields within neuroscience, and that's where you're utilizing imaging and electrophysiology techniques to get a better understanding of the structure of the brain. And one of the biggest problems with that is that we have yet to be able to track several neurons within the human brain. And if we were able to do that, it would give us a much better insight into how exactly the brain is working. And that inability to image these thousands of neurons is one of the big challenges in neuroscience. And one of the other big questions in neuroscience is that how can cognition be so flexible? So what we saw today in artificial intelligence, the way that machine learning is training itself, although it is incredibly complex, it is still like nowhere near the way that our own brain processes information, because we have yet to understand how can our cognition be so flexible, and how is it that we're able to be able to modify the way that we think. And that complexity is one of the big questions of neuroscience. And another one of the big questions is it possible to enhance brain function? And that's not possible to figure out until we actually understand how the brain is working. I just wanted to thank Ms. Bell Hansen for this incredible opportunity to present to you all, and I'd like to thank you all for being here today. And I'll leave you all with a quote from Francis Crick. There is no scientific study more vital to man than the study of his own brain. Our entire view of the universe depends on it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was a fantastic workshop. We do have questions sitting in Q&A. How long is the typical lifespan of a neuron?
Sure. So I'm not sure the exact answer to that question, but I would assume that because neurons once they die they're gone. I would assume that neurons kind of stay with you your entire life, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So you'd have to check elsewhere. Sorry.
All right, thank you so much for that. Friendly reminder, are being recorded, so you'll be able to access them